All right, moving on to 5.4 of chapter 5. Here we go. So now we're going to be taking a look at how you use all of that evidence to make the actual theory of evolution. There are two specific people we're going to be taking a look at, and we are going to be in textbook page 150 to 152. So the theory of evolution is going to help us explain how did this giraffe get a longer and longer neck? How did these animals go from maybe like these weird mammals to the whale that's also a mammal, right? And then how these different finches or birds got their different beaks and or head size. So let's move on. Here we go. Here are the key questions you're going to want to take a look at. You can pause the video if you'd like. And now we're going to move on. All right, so 5.4, making of a theory. Okay, first of all, what is a scientific theory? So it's going to be a model that takes into account all of the known scientific evidence or data that we have in front of us and tries to explain what is happening behind all of this data. And of course, it can change as new data is discovered. You may have also heard of something called the scientific method, and the scientific method is one way to get a scientific theory. You take a look at what the problem is, you form a hypothesis, which is an educated guess, make some observations, test it out, etc., get all the data, and then you either have to do more experiments or you draw a conclusion about it and say, hey, this is what we think can happen, and then communicate it to the rest of the world. An example of this could be, what do you think happened to the mammoths? Do you think it was overhunting, or do you think it was because of climate change that the mammoths started dying off more and more and more? So back in the day, it was thought that because of human beings that overhunted the mammoths, they thought, okay, that's why the mammoths died off and we have no more mammoths here on Earth anymore. However, when they took a DNA test and they took a look at when the mammoth population actually started decreasing, it was 20,000 years ago, which was before human beings, and not 14,000 years ago as previously thought. 20,000 years ago, and they're saying, oh, this was actually during the time when the climate of the Earth started changing. And this was before human beings. So how can we say that it was the humans that caused a decline in mammoth population if the population of the mammoth started declining before the humans? So that's how you take the data and you put it together with an explanation to form a scientific theory. So now the theory is mammoth populations didn't start decreasing because of humans, but they started decreasing because of climate change 20,000 years ago. So for us, what is the theory behind evolution? Why are living organisms the way they are? Where do they come from? And why do they look the way they do? So the original idea was living things were actually fixed, and whatever form they appeared on Earth, however long that may have been, is whatever form they are now. An example of thinking about this would be giraffes have always had long necks, whales have always lived in the water, or polar bears have always had white fur, etc., etc. This was widely accepted until the late 1700s or the early 1800s, until one person named Lamarck, this is just his last name, proposed an idea. His idea was that organisms had an internal desire or force inside themselves that made them want to change for the better. Think about maybe like you looking in the mirror and being like, ooh, I want to work out. That's my inner desire or force, and I want to change for the better. So what happens is these organisms, because of this desire or force, they can produce new parts, get rid of unwanted parts, or change their existing parts, okay? The key part here that I've bolded for you is any changes in certain structures would then also be passed on to the offspring. This is what Lamarck said causes the changes in the species to make them more and more different over time. Eventually, the whole species would eventually adapt to their environment as all of this desire or force would cause more and more changes, and then all the offspring would get all of these changes to adapt to the environment. This is really important because he was the first one to present a theory that included a mechanism for change, basically explaining how species would change over time. And also, even though we know that Lamarck's theory has been falsified, he was the first person to recognize, hey, the environment is really important in evolution. If the environment wasn't so challenging, evolution wouldn't be so drastic or even exist. So his theory would be called Lamarckism because his name is Lamarck. Okay. His theory describes the inheritance of acquired characteristics. So let's take a look at this picture over here. So originally the giraffes had a short-necked ancestor, but this ancestor keeps stretching their neck to reach the leaves higher and higher and higher until eventually the stretching neck becomes longer and longer and longer. And guess what? When this giraffe has offspring, then their offspring will also have long necks. Right. You might be thinking, okay, wait a minute. Now it sounds preposterous. Okay. So whatever feature a parent acquired during its life would then be passed on to the offspring. Now, the reason why this is not true is because, well, we know now more about what genetics means and what DNA is and the importance of parental DNA. He had a false concept of inheritance not based in genetics. That was the problem. This was not based in genetics, and the genetics is what's passed on, not the acquired characteristics. Another human example could be the following situation would be true if Lamarck was correct about his theory of acquired characteristics. So a person dyes their hair green, maybe because of their quote-unquote inner desire/force, then they have children. Lamarck would say that these children would also have green hair because one of their parents acquired this characteristic. Now you're starting to believe, okay, this is really out to lunch, and really Lamarck unfortunately was not correct. Even though Lamarck saw what was happening, and he's like, okay, I see that the species change over time, he had a false idea of why that happened. Next, we have Charles Darwin, who looked at Lamarck's theory and was like, okay, let me just try this again. In 1831, he went on a 5-year trip on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And this gave him an opportunity to study many different life forms as he traveled the world on this path. He went from Great Britain to South America, around South America, Galapagos Islands, across Australia, down through the Indian Ocean, I think. That's what it is, over there. Down around Africa, and then back to South America, and back to Great Britain. So let's take a look at what Charles Darwin saw and what his theory of evolution was. It's called natural selection. Okay. So in the mid-1800s, he published a book based on his 5-year voyage, okay? It's called The Origin of Species by the means of natural selection. Natural selection is going to be what we're going to be focusing on, and he saw a lot of different finches of the Galapagos Islands, 1,000 kilometers west of Ecuador. So when he saw these finches, it gave him an idea about what evolution what was driving evolution, and it was very different than what Lamarck said. So let's take a look. So the Galapagos Islands, very, very unique ecosystem, many different trees, many different iguanas, many different turtles, and many different organisms in general. Why are they so unique? Because we'll take a look at how far away all these islands are. Number one, away from the equator. Sorry, not away from the equator, away from Ecuador, and also they're very far apart from each other. All right. Now, besides Darwin, there's also a few different people who contributed to his theory of evolution by natural selection. First helper was named Malthus. He had a mathematics essay on populations which said all species produce more offspring than are able to survive. That means not everybody survives in a particular population of a species. So Darwin realized that there had to be competition if more offspring were produced than were able to survive. Second person that helped out Charles Darwin was a person whose last name was Wallace, who's pictured over here. He had a very large name, so we're not going to get into that. But Wallace, actually very far away from Darwin, I think he was studying some organisms in Malaysia. He actually came up with the same idea. He independently arrived at the same conclusions as Darwin about the evolution of organisms, and then he sent Charles Darwin a letter saying, hey, I came up with this too, you should probably publish this letter, and you should probably publish your findings in a paper because I think we're both right. So Darwin, after reading that, was like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll do it, yeah. So what are some key points of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection? Okay, so number one, from Malthus's essay, he knows that number one, there's going to be overproduction of offspring, right? The number of offspring produced by a species is greater than the number that can survive and reproduce, right? You only have so much food for all the different offspring. Because of that, you're also going to have a struggle for existence. Point number two, organisms of the same species must compete for the same resources in order to survive and also to reproduce, right? When these two bears are fighting, they're competing for the fish in the river. There's only so much fish. When these two mountain rams are competing like this, they're competing for the right to mate because there are only so many females to mate, and they want to reproduce so that their genetics can survive onto the next generation. There's only a limited amount of resources and a limited amount of mateable females, I guess, and they have to struggle for existence or compete with one another. Because of that, we have a little bit of natural selection going on. So let's continue on. By the way, I want you to think of these 5 points as 5 points that exist at the same time. It's not a series of steps. It's not like, oh, because there's overproduction, there's then after that going to be competition, and then because of competition, there's going to be variation. No. I want you to think about all this sort of like at the same time. All right, so variation is the third point. There's going to be a variety in different species, not different species, different individuals of the same species, right? They are not always going to be alike. For example, some lions can be brown, and some lions, because of a genetic mutation, could be white, right? The offspring inherit most of a parent's traits because of genetic inheritance, but not all of them. Some traits actually arise randomly because of just mutations. These mutations cause differences in the individuals of a population. And then when you have sexual reproduction, it creates more and more variability. These are going to be things that you actually learn about in Bio-30, so look out for that. For example, like over here on the right side, all these snails, they're probably the same species of snail, but guess what? They have different colors. Why do they have different colors, even if they're the same species? Because of variation in the population, because of genetic mutations in the DNA, as well as sexual reproduction. Now, with all that variation in the species, what's going to happen? You're going to have survival of the fittest. So individuals with either more favorable traits or actually smarter behavior are going to allow it to survive best in their specific environment due to the variation or the advantageous variation in their genetics. Because they have an advantage and they're better suited for the environment, they are going to be more likely to pass on the genetics to offspring, okay? And that's going to cause, this last part here, speciation. Over time, the more and more strong traits are going to become more and more reproduced because they are more fit to survive and more fit to reproduce. And because of that, over time, these favorable traits are going to accumulate and show up more and more in the population of a species. What happens now is evolution has actually occurred. These traits have evolved from a common ancestor, and because of, number one, genetic variation, and number two, survival of the fittest, we now have number 5, speciation occurring. This is when, for example, a common ancestor changes so much, so now they become a different species of organism. So these are different fruit flies that have different characteristics that are now going to be different species, or you also have, for example, a common ancestor of these different cats, and because of the genetic variation as well as survival of the fittest in their specific environments, you're going to have a house cat, a cheetah. Is this a cheetah? Is this a leopard? Cheetah, leopard, cheetah, cheetah. We have a black leopard over here, and then we have a lion over here. These are different species of felines. Why are they different species? Because over time, more favorable traits accumulated in the population of a species, the common ancestor, until they became so different, they became different species. Understanding these 5 points and how they all work together to make a new species is incredibly important going into Bio-30. So let's see if we can apply it to a new situation, or like not a new situation, but I guess an old situation, but you're going to be doing something new. Okay, forget about my weird wording. Here we go. So we had Lamarck using giraffes from before. How about now we try to use Darwin's 5 points of evolution via natural selection to explain how the giraffe came to exist if they had a short-necked ancestor, okay? So the first one has been given to you. The first one we know is going to be overproduction, okay? So back in the day, there were many more short-necked giraffe ancestors living than could possibly survive and reproduce. Maybe there was not enough land. Maybe there was not enough mates to mate with. Maybe there's not enough food for these short-necked giraffe ancestors to live. So why or how does Darwin explain the evolution of a giraffe using these 5 points? So O is overproduction, okay? 2 is going to be, well, what's 2 again? Oh, I've already forgotten. 2 is struggle for existence. I knew that, okay? 3 is going to be variation in the population. 4 is going to be survival of the fittest, and then 5 is going to be eventually speciation. So quickly take a break and see if you can figure out, well, like take a break from listening to me and see if you can apply Darwin's 5 points to explain how giraffes came to exist using this first explanation as a template. All right, so let's take a look at your answers. Here we go. So back in the day, many more short-necked giraffe ancestors living than could possibly survive and reproduce. Number 2, struggle for existence. The short-necked ancestors competed with one another for the limited resources in the environment. Struggle for existence with each other, that to compete for the limited resources. Number 3, variation. Because of the differences among the giraffe ancestors, because of random mutations, some giraffe ancestors were slightly different and they possibly had longer necks. Number 4, survival of the fittest. These giraffe ancestors with longer necks, again, because of the mutations in the DNA, okay, they were able to eat plants higher up in trees, which also increased their chances of survival, and, very important right here, reproduction. Finally, number 5, speciation. Over time, more and more of these long neck giraffe ancestors were able to survive and reproduce more than their shorter necked individuals, and then over time the long neck mutation became the dominant trait in the population, and thus then all the ancestors got the long neck trait in their DNA. Over time, over millions, maybe millions of years, now you get the present day species of giraffe that all have long necks. Why? Because of the evolution of the short-necked ancestors, according to Darwin's 5 points. So this is going to be a compare and contrast sort of a dealio between Lamarck's view and the Darwin-Wallace view over here. So why does the giraffe have a long neck? For Lamarck, originally the short-necked ancestors stretched their necks and then they became longer and longer, and then their sons or daughters or offspring also had longer necks because the parent changed their physical trait. For Darwin, they said originally all the short-necked giraffes had some variety of their length of the neck, and then natural selection naturally favors the longer necks because they had an advantage. Because they had an advantage, they could be more ready to survive and reproduce, and because of that, because the longer-necked giraffes were able to survive and reproduce more, there were just simply more offspring with the long neck DNA. And then over time, everybody had the long neck DNA. And that's it. So we have compared and contrasted the 2 different theories of evolution, one by Lamarck, one by Darwin, also assisted by Malthus and Wallace, and applied them into different scenarios with the giraffe, and, later on you'll apply it to something else. All right, so here's your practice for this lesson here. So check out page 150 to 152 for chapter 5.4. There are some questions you can do as well. And optional, you can check out the Survival of the Sneakiest cartoon, which is going to be posted on Classroom. Here's the link, but I'll post it online, don't worry. And finally, if you're taking a look at question number 2 on page 152, here's a little bit more help. Because it's going to ask you to compare the 2 different theories. You can compare the 2 different theories by answering these 3 questions for each of the theories. What's the force for evolution according to these 2 scientists? How do the beneficial traits seen in an organism arise in the first place? And what happens with the traits of an organism that are unused? Do they still pass on to the next generation or not? So that's how you can do question number 2. And I think that's going to be it for this week. Hope you have a great weekend. All right, see you everybody. Bye-bye.